Don, the man I was talking about, I will see on Thursday night because we're on another committee.
Okay.
together.
If you have time, I'm happy to stay on a little bit after the end of this and chat a little more about it.
Okay, I have another meeting right after this. So
Oh, okay. Well, maybe sometime tomorrow then.
That would be great.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say Thursday morning would be the better of the times or the days for me.
Okay. I think before 10, that would be good for me.
Okay, that would be good. That would be good for me too.
Okay.
All right, let's get started. So welcome to the Conservation Planning for Landowners webinar series. This is the third session of a 4-part series. This week we will be talking about land trusts and conservation easements, and next week is our last session, and that will be on forest land, wildlife, and watershed protection. My name is Jess Casterline. I'm interning for Belknap County Conservation District. BCCD is the host this evening, as well as Prescott Farm, and there are a number of other organizations that helped plan and make this webinar series possible. Before we get started, just some webinar information. This session is being recorded. Participants will be muted for the length of the webinar, and your video is optional. You can submit questions through the chat box feature throughout the presentation at the bottom of your screen, and they will be addressed throughout, and there will be also time at the end of the presentation for questions. If you have any technical difficulties, you can chat me privately and I can help you work through the issue. And I will turn over to Donna Hepp, who is the chairman of Belknap County Conservation District.
Thanks, Jess. Welcome. We're glad to have you with us tonight. I'm Donna Hepp. I'm the chair for the Belknap County Conservation District, and Dean Anson is another member of our board. And conservation districts are actually going to be celebrating 75 years. Our anniversary is next year. Across the country, conservation districts have a role in working with local landowners and towns on helping to promote good use of soil and water and other natural resources. And one of the things that we are engaged with here in Belknap County is doing a lot of demonstration projects on conservation and also doing workshops. And we've been going virtual this year, like a lot of folks, and we're really glad to have you with us. We have a lot of exciting projects going on, but I'll hold on that one and just focus in on conservation planning, which is really key, we think, in helping landowners reach their objectives for their land. And we've had a series of really great speakers sharing information with us, and we're really pleased to have our speakers with us tonight to talk about another important component of conservation planning, which is looking at some of the opportunities that are out there in terms of protecting prime agriculture and forest lands and wildlife habitat through some of the kinds of land conservation measures that we're going to be talking about tonight.
So we have two guest presenters tonight. We have Don Barry, who is the president of Lakes Region Conservation Trust. We also have Ann Bennett, who is a property manager of a conservation easement property in Jackson, New Hampshire. So I will turn it over to Don Barry to start.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Donna, and thanks for everybody else for joining in tonight. I'm, as Jess mentioned, I'm president of the Lakes Region Conservation Trust. Probably most of you know what a land trust is, but I'll just briefly say it just in case some don't. A land trust is a nonprofit organization with a board of trustees or board of directors, and in some cases staff, and in some cases not staff. Sometimes land trusts rely entirely on volunteers, but typically land trusts protect land through two mechanisms: one, ownership of land, and two, conservation easements, which is the main topic that I'm going to talk about tonight. We at LRCT have, through our history of about 40 years now, conserved about 28,000 acres of land in total. About 18,000 of that is land that we own, and about 9,000 of that, or plus or minus both of these figures, is land that we have in conservation easements. Some land trusts have a lot more in easements than in owned land, and some land trusts are the other way around. But I'm going to focus on conservation easements, and I should just say to start out, the way that we acquire land or conservation easements is sometimes through gifts of the land or gifts of the easements, and sometimes through purchase of the land or the easements. I won't get into a lot of details about purchasing at this point, because that's a whole area of fundraising and grant opportunities that I'm happy to talk about if people have questions. But I'll focus on the process for a conservation easement when it's donated, because I think that's what landowners are often wanting to understand so that they can decide whether it's a good option for them to consider. Let me start out by just saying what a conservation easement is. And Jess, there's one of the two documents I had to put up is the thing that's called the conservation easement outline. So maybe you could put that up on the screen when you get a minute, and then I'll give a little introduction and then walk through that. This document that you're seeing is really an outline of an easement. I'll just start out with a few words. A conservation easement is a legal agreement between the landowner and a land conservation organization. And it could be a land trust like my organization, but it could also be a town conservation commission. Various towns and cities some are more active than others in holding conservation easements, but that's certainly an option that landowners could explore. It's sometimes, an easement is sometimes described by suggesting that people think about land as ownership of land as having a bundle of rights. Sometimes the analogy is used, a bundle of sticks, where you think about each stick as a certain right that goes along with the land: the right to build a house, the right to do commercial development, the right to subdivide, the right to do timbering, the right to do farming. And if you think about the land, the ownership as having a bundle of rights, the conservation easement is a mechanism that separates the right to build, develop, or subdivide from all those other rights of ownership: the rights to timber, farm, walk the land, do recreation, enjoy the scenic beauty of the land. And through a conservation easement, the landowner is in a sense conveying those rights away from its ownership to the land trust or to the Conservation Commission. Not so that we, the land trust or Conservation Commission, could do the development, but so that those rights go away and the land no longer has those rights are no longer connected with the land. So the landowner can still own the land, use it for timbering and farming and recreation and enjoyment, and sell it to another owner, can pass it on to family members through a will or through a gift, but the rights to develop the land have been extinguished through the grant of the conservation easement to the land trust. As I said, the easement holder doesn't have the right to develop the land. The easement holder simply acquires the responsibility to make sure that the land isn't developed and to make sure that the other terms of the conservation easement are obeyed. Through history, a conservation easement is in perpetuity, so it's a mechanism by which a landowner can ensure that the land is never developed and that the landowner's vision for the land to be farm or forest land or simply beautiful wild land can continue forever. The outline shows kind of the components of a conservation easement. And a typical easement is a really long legal document. Some of you have seen them, and you probably are very familiar with them. And there's a lot of legal jargon in a conservation easement, but this outline gives you a sense of what you would find in a typical conservation easement. And so you see there's a section that talks about the purposes of the easement, and those are linked to requirements of the Internal Revenue Code, the federal statute that governs conservation easements to some degree, as well as there are state statutory provisions as well. And then a section of the easement will describe the natural qualities that the easement is protecting. And then at the bottom of that page and onto the next page of that document are the real meat of the easement, the restrictions that apply to the property, described the lingo as the use limitations, the reserved rights of the grantor. The grantor is the landowner. You'll hear discussion of grantor and grantee. Grantor is the landowner, grantee is the easement holder. And so the use restrictions or use limitations talk about the fact that the land is to be maintained as open space, that it can be used for agriculture, forestry, subject to certain requirements for a forest management plan, for example, limitations or prohibitions on structures, prohibition on subdivision, other prohibitions that would have negative impacts on the environmental and natural values of the land, like prohibitions on dumping of waste, underground and above ground storage tanks, limitations on vehicles. There may be some exceptions for vehicles that are needed to manage the property. Easements can also allow snowmobiles if that's something that the owner wants to include. Then there's a section that specifies reserved rights of the grantor that may talk about the right to maintain existing roads and driveways and bridges and trails, may allow posting of signs for certain purposes, may allow construction of farm ponds and ponds for other purposes, wildlife habitat and fire protection. Provisions allowing maintenance of utilities that already exist. Provisions that allow construction of structures within limitations. For example, structures needed for agricultural or forestry uses that the easement allows. Just to give you an example of a sugar house that might be needed in connection with maple sugaring, or a barn in connection with agricultural use. Those can be allowed in an easement. And then there are some what are called the affirmative rights of the easement holder, and primary among those is the right to come onto the property to monitor the property, because the easement holder's primary responsibility is to periodically, usually annually, inspect the property to make sure that the easement requirements are being followed. The easement may also give the easement holder the right to build trails or to allow the public to come onto the property for recreational purposes, but that's usually something that's an optional provision that's negotiated between the land trust or the conservation commission and the landowner. The affirmative rights may also allow the easement holder to mow agricultural lands if that's an important component of the property, and perhaps in the future the landowner is unable to do that and it's important to preserve the agricultural potential of the land. The land trust may well have the option of doing the mowing if that's needed. And then there are lots of other provisions that I'm not going to talk about because they're kind of very legalistic sorts of things that if you're granting an easement, you will certainly want to study them carefully and get whatever legal advice you feel comfortable or feel that you need. But I won't take a lot of time here because they're frankly not that exciting to talk about. And I know that we have only limited time. So why don't I just pause for a minute, and Jess, if you could remind me of what time we're at, because I'm not seeing a clock on my screen and I want to make sure we're moving along and also leaving time for questions if anyone has them.
Yep, it's 7:17 right now.
Okay, great. Any questions so far?
Don, can you give us kind of an example of a family story?
Sure.
You know, not the names or whatnot, but just, you know, how some families decided to do this and you know, how that kind of process works out,
Sure.
just as
Sure.
an example.
And I'll give you an example that will make a point that I want to make later on, which is that sometimes work on a conservation easement project takes a long time. And my example is a family that we have, LRCT has worked with on a conservation easement that we finished about a year and a half ago in the Ossipee Mountains. And it's an easement that covers about 1,615 acres of mostly forest land, but some agricultural land. And the forest land, the easement provides for some of the forest land to be used for timbering and some of it to be kept in what's called a forever wild state, because the family wanted some of it never to be timbered. We started working on that easement in 2010 and finished it in December of 2018. So that tells you what can happen. And the process in that family, maybe this is an extreme in terms of time, but this kind of process happens in lots of families. There are multiple people involved, in this family, everyone wanted to do the easement. That isn't always the case. Sometimes there are some people that want to do it and some people don't, and there needs to be some internal discussion, and you, the land trust or conservation commission representative, have to be careful to not get too deep into what may need to be a family discussion that you're not part of. In our case, the family, all the decision makers wanted to do it, but they had various ideas about what they wanted the easement to say. Some of them were very committed to this wilderness forever wild concept. For some of them, that was much less important. So there were a lot of details that had to be discussed among various family members at annual family meetings, and sometimes with LRCT involved and sometimes with LRCT not involved. And there were various, it turned out that there were some title issues that had to be resolved, some questions about the ownership status of certain parts of the land. The land had been acquired in lots of transactions over close to 100 years, and there were some strange loose ends in the title record of the property that had to be straightened out before we could complete the easement. But so anyway, it was a long process. It was mostly very enjoyable to work with the family, but there were times when we were all getting impatient. But we finally reached the end of the line and finished up the easement, and everybody was very pleased with the end result. So that's what you can run into if you're working with a family or if you are part of a family. You should be prepared for the need to talk with whoever is in a role to be part of the decision, and recognize that different people will have different viewpoints. Different people will have different levels of understanding of what land conservation is all about. And there may be an educational process that takes a fairly long time before everybody's on the same page.
So the bottom line, though, for the family was that they wanted to see it remain as forest land and agricultural land.
Yes, absolutely. It was land that had been acquired, as I said, through the years by previous generations, and quite a large group of family members really cherished it. Most of them have scattered to all parts of the world, in fact, but come back to this land in Tamworth each summer in many cases, and really cherished it and wanted to keep it as the family place that they've enjoyed so much for their own children and grandchildren. Any other questions? I thought I would put up one other document, and Jess, this is the one that says the something, I think the title is Conservation Easement Process Outline. This is just to give you a sense of what the process is, and it kind of picks up on what I was just talking about. We have a much longer document that explains all of these steps that we give to landowners, but this is just kind of an outline of how we go about tackling a project. And each land trust will have a little different approach, but the same basic steps are will, I think, be part of the process for any land trust or for any conservation commission considering a conservation easement project. First, there's the initial contact with the landowner and learning about the land and learning about what the landowning individual or family wants to do, what their objectives are, what they cherish about the land, what they're hoping to achieve through the conservation easement. And then we have a lands committee and staff who go out to visit the property if it's something that we're interested in considering further. And then we discuss it at a lands committee meeting. And often it gets discussed at multiple meetings. If it's something we're interested in pursuing, there are then some discussions with the landowners about what the easement might contain, and we would be going over that easement outline with them and talking with some specificity about the different issues that have to be addressed in the easement and trying to get a sense from them as to what they would like to see in the easement, and in some cases say what we would like to see in the easement, because there are times when we have some ideas and some objectives in what we'd like to see in an easement because of what we think are the values of the land and how we see the land fitting into the bigger picture of conservation for our organization and conservation for the towns where we are working. So there are some times when people might not initially want to consider a particular easement provision, and we might push on them a little to say why we think something would be important or not important to address in the easement. Eventually, the lands committee makes a recommendation to our board of trustees once we've fleshed out the potential project a little more. Our board has to approve each project for us to do it. Once there's an approval, then we continue on working with the landowners in formalizing the easement and getting drafts of the easement going back and forth. Usually we take the lead in drafting and the landowners react to that. Sometimes the landowners get their own attorney involved and play a more active role in the drafting. Among the things that we have to do, we as a land trust have to do to responsibly do the transaction, is to make sure the boundaries are surveyed and marked, because we need to be able to see where the land is in order to do our monitoring. And we need to make sure that 30 years from now, when all of us who worked on the easement aren't around anymore, that whoever's in charge then, both on the landowner side and on the easement holder side, that everyone is on the same page as to where the edges of the easement are. If there are boundary problems, it's going to make everyone's life miserable in the future. So that's a very important element in the process. We do an environmental assessment, of what's called a phase 1 assessment, to make sure there isn't any contamination or waste disposal on the property that would create liability problems later for anyone. We do a title search, and I mentioned that earlier, the way that issue came up in that with the family property that I was talking about. One of the key things for easement holders, and various land trusts approach this in different ways, but since we have an obligation to monitor the property, and then if we discover problems in our monitoring, we have to get them resolved so that we are sure that the easement is being complied with. We need to provide for some funding to cover the costs that we will have, staff costs and potentially even legal costs later on down the road. So as part of the easement process, we as a land trust need to think about where can we find some easement stewardship funding that we can put away in our stewardship fund to help to support our future work to take care of this easement. And that may mean in some cases, we would ask the landowner for a contribution. In some cases, the landowner is unable to provide that kind of a contribution, and we have to think about other sources of money. It may be that people who live in the area would be willing to contribute because they are going to appreciate the fact that their neighbor is conserving beautiful land in their neighborhood. it may be that the local conservation commission has a conservation fund and is willing to make a contribution toward the easement stewardship. But this is something that land trusts have, I think in the early years of land trusts, we didn't think so much about this, and we've been educated to know that we need to pay a lot of attention to the need for easement stewardship funding. So that's always part of the discussion. And then we have to do what's called a baseline documentation report, which is a description of the property as of the time when the easement is granted, so that we have a record of the natural values of the property and the condition of the property that the easement is intended to protect. And so we have that record to compare to when we monitor the easement in future years and look at the property and see if there have been any changes to the property that are not consistent or not compliant with the easement. Also, if an easement is being donated and the donor of the easement is receiving a federal income tax deduction, the Internal Revenue Code requires that the baseline documentation be prepared as part of qualifying for that charitable deduction. So that's a very important step in the process. And once all those things are done, the closing on the easement can occur. A real estate closing, but there's a lot of work to be done before that. I'll just mention a couple of other things that apply when an easement is donated. An appraisal of the easement is needed to substantiate the value of the easement that the landowner is seeking a tax deduction for. And that's ordinarily something that the landowner needs to pay for. There are exceptions to that I was just talking with Dean about before the meeting. I won't get into it here because it's kind of in the weeds, but that's a key element if there's going to be a tax deduction for the landowner. And then once the appraisal has been prepared, there's an IRS form that has to be completed by the landowner, signed by the appraiser, and then signed by the land trust to confirm the conveyance of that easement. And I won't get into more details on that again, because it's kind of the legal and financial nitty-gritty. On the outline, I won't take time because I think we're probably close to the end here, but on that outline, at the last couple of bullets are just a quick summary of the types of costs that a land trust can expect to incur in doing a conservation easement transaction, and the types of costs that a landowner can expect to incur in doing a conservation easement. And then at the very bottom, the warning that we always give: we, the land trust or a conservation commission, are not the legal and financial advisors for the landowner. We can certainly provide advice. We can provide help. I won't use the word advice. If the landowner wants legal and financial advice, they feel that they're not qualified on their own to evaluate those issues, they need to seek their own legal and financial advice. And we're certainly happy to talk with those legal and financial advisors, but the landowner shouldn't be relying and can't be relying on the land trust or the Conservation Commission for that kind of advice. So let me stop there and see if there are questions. We're probably close to, or I hope we haven't gone too far over my time.
I don't currently see any questions in the chat box, but we'll also have time at the end for any questions that people have.
I had just one for you, Don. So it sounds like that folks at, these 28,000 acres that are protected through the Lakes Region Trust, a lot of those are easements.
Yes.
And, so what's in it for the landowner often is just that the family wants to have that legacy protected of land protection. And also it sounds like either whether they donate the value of the conservation of the rights that they forgo, so that's substantive enough that that's beneficial to the family as well in terms of tax benefits, whether they donate part or all, or just have a reduced value of their property because of the donation because of the commitment to have a reduction in their rights. And I know there's other programs and grant programs that we work with through conservation districts and the Natural Resource Conservation Service that help provide funding sources, to help purchase some of those development rights. So, but that's interesting to know what all the steps are. It's pretty involved. It takes some time, clearly, but it's one of those ways that we have to keep New Hampshire in terms of protecting our land base of the vast agriculture and forest land. So exciting to see, and many thanks to you and the other land trusts that are doing this great work for all of us.
Thanks, Donna. And there are, Jess has a couple of other documents that I think she's going to be able to circulate to the group afterwards. And one of those has a little bit, Donna, thank you for highlighting the possible other tax benefits. That one of the other documents does have a little description of the additional tax benefits that can come along with the grant of a conservation easement. I often hear people say that if tax benefits are the landowner's only objective, probably this isn't the right thing for them. And I certainly have seen in the time that I've been in this work, which is a lot of years, that often the tax benefits are important to the landowner, but the real first objective of the landowner is preserving land that the landowner cherishes, the landowner's family cherishes, in many cases that the community cherishes. And I think that's certainly the financial benefits are helpful to us all, but I think the satisfaction that the landowners achieve through this process, and frankly the appreciation that they appropriately receive from their communities, I think are very, very valuable.
Mm-hmm. I think one other point that you and I have talked about, Don, is that there are, in many cases there are former, really good agricultural soils that aren't being farmed right now. And I know some of the land trusts are now looking at matchmaking to see there's some young farmers that, can't afford to purchase to land, but would love to be able to farm it. So in some cases, I know land trusts are doing a little bit of that matchmaking to get some of that land back into agricultural production, which is, I think, pretty exciting.
Yes. Yep.
All right, thank you, Don. We will turn it over to Ann Bennett.
Hi there. Again, thank you to all of you for hosting this event. A little bit about my background is having been a longtime resident of Jackson and having a number of different occupations, from newspaper writing. I've been a school administrator, but throughout all of it since the early 70s, I have been first a seasonal help and caretaker, and then in the mid 1990s, taking on a management position for a property here in the East Branch Valley, and working for a family who I've now worked for 47 years. So this is really the story of one easement, and I thought it's going to illustrate some of the points that Don made. I think that, and before I start, there's some, remind me, Jess, were you going to start the PowerPoint? If you would share that. I have some photographs I want to share. Most of them are mine, but I also wanted to give credit where credit is due, which is several of these, I I wanted to mention Deb Marnick from Conway NRCS, Rick Stieber, who's a wonderful wildlife photographer who's on the board of Tin Mountain, and Anna Strunkel, who's an ornithologist and a wonderful naturalist. So some of their photographs are in this mix as well, and I just wanted to thank them. So both in my personal involvement with the Dundee easement and also my work as a board member with the Land Trust, I've really come to understand that many, many easements, and most really are a story. I mean, they are, sometimes it's a community forest, and sometimes it is a privately donated easement. And sometimes it can be both of those things. But in the case of the Dundee easement, which is in the eastern section of Jackson in the East Branch Valley, this was about the owner's deep sense of place and respect and commitment to the property that they had acquired over several decades. And wanting to make sure that that would be something that could be enjoyed for future generations, as we say, in perpetuity. So this is an aerial, clearly an aerial image of what is the Dundee easement. And if you think of sort of mountain communities like mine in Jackson, there were lots of sort of sub neighborhoods, and Dundee was one of those. It was a thriving farming community in the mid 1800s, really through 1910, 1920. You can see at the bottom of the easement along the East Branch Railroad went along the course at the edge of this property. There was a lot going on. But by the 1930s, farmers, for the most part, had gone to the Midwest, or folks had moved to town because it was an easier way to make a living. And many of these buildings had fallen to disrepair. The fields were growing in. And when Maxwell and Elizabeth Foster first visited this area, they were residents of Ipswich, Massachusetts. They were looking for a little place along the stream. And over the course of starting in 1940, they cobbled together really half a dozen old hillside farms and eventually owned 800 acres or a square mile, with a mile along the East Branch of the Saco and along the Dundee Road, and the northern edge of their property abuts the National Forest. So it's part of that somewhat, well, in our part of the end of the state, not unusual, but gift of contiguous green space. I mean, it is a big chunk of unfragmented land. In their case, in their planning process, in their 80s, in about 1980, they gifted about 2/3 of their property to the New England Forestry Foundation and retained about 250 acres, more or less oval in the middle of land that surrounds them, that NEF owns and manages for active forestry, because that is their mission. So it is this land that you see that was put into easement in 2013. I thought it might be nice just to look at the landscape a little bit. If we could, can I work this? No, that's good. So this is, the easement is, say, call it really 200, 220 acres of mature mixed beautiful forest land and about 20 acres of upland field. There's some wetlands, there's a man-made pond. And I think that when we look at it, as well as the frontage on the East Branch, which this property is a wonderful protector of water quality. And talk about forever wild, the forest had not been harvested at all, certainly during their tenure. And so you have this mature forest. I think best case scenario, and Don certainly, I think, spoke to this really well, a conservation easement, it really formalizes the values, the stewardship values, and the love and sense of place that the donors are committed to. And certainly there may be a tax incentive. There was in this case, but that was not ultimately what drove this. It was about holding this really remarkable landscape in place in a region which is just being transformed at an astonishing pace. So I don't want to make it simple, and actually Don's already talked about this, because once you have multiple owners, or even if it's just a couple, you may be committed to the concept of an easement, but it takes hours and weeks and months and discussion and wrestling with the ideas, because it is a complicated legal document, and you are both giving away or donating your development rights, but you're also trying to decide what to retain in terms of your rights moving forward. In this case, privacy was a huge concern. And so the idea, because the property is bisected by a town road, which becomes a Class 6 road, which becomes a permanent Forest Service road. So there is absolutely the right of public access. But well, at the same time, they don't post their property, but they wanted to believe that they would be able to retain their right of privacy. And certainly during the summer of COVID, that has been a huge challenge. But just moving forward, I think for me, one of the really memorable moments towards the end of the discussion with William Abbott, the executive director of the Land Trust, and that particular day, actually, Ellen Snyder, who the wildlife biologist, who's actually also now the stewardship director for the town of Durham, and who had written the wildlife habitat management plan, were at the table. And one of the owners was beginning to hedge a bit about the fact that he was not sure it was really his place to make this decision for his children. And ultimately, the conversation came around to the fact that, the future is unknowable, but you have the ability at this point in time to secure it, at least in terms of what the landscape is going to hold. And frankly, it just becomes more complicated when there are more seats at the table. And when future generations become involved who are not connected to the land in the same way, it just gets more complicated. So ultimately, the easement was finalized in December of 2013, and good for all of us. So prior, actually, to the easement, Ellen had, I had met Nels Lerchadal through my board work, and we had begun a series of management practices in concert with NRCS. And one of those was underwriting part of the cost of the wildlife management plan that Ellen Snyder developed. And in this case, this was far more a priority for them as owners than a forestry plan. And ultimately, this served the purpose for the conservation easement, because it also included some pretty significant patch cuts and forestry practices. But just to give you a sense of what we have ongoing in terms of different practices that we have partnered, and different forest and soil types. So that was the purpose of that. And to make the point that we were already fortunately working with NRCS, and one of Ellen's recommendations, frankly, had been to implement conservation easement. And she was really very, very helpful in moving the process forward. and already having this plan in place, which again formalized so many of their interests, because the foster family were of that generation of they took being a naturalist very seriously. They're great birders. Elizabeth Foster was on the board of Massachusetts Audubon. And so in taking on some of the NRCS practices, they were, a number of them we were already really doing. I mean, there were always birdhouses. The barn was, the beautiful 1840s barn was always left open for access for barn swallows, which is fabulous and also really messy. The deep woods offers habitat for a regular nesting goshawk, hare. Jess, if you don't mind, just move into the bird shots. I mean, now we have a lot more bird, you know, we probably have 30 bird houses. And as I said, the swallow population, which is so challenged, is a big interest of these folks. They really pay attention to it. I catalog all the birdhouses, what our nesting percentage is, who's being used by bluebirds. I mean, we really, as we say, get into the weeds here sometimes, but can we move to the next one? Delayed mowing has always been a practice here to protect ground nesting birds. More recently, really making sure that we're not only doing that, but in some cases trying to enhance the milkweed. I will have to say sometimes delayed mowing, when I look at it and the weedy growth we get with it, I feel like the place is going to hell in a handcart because it's very messy, but the results are really, really noticeable over the last 10 years. Again, I don't want to mention, this is hours and hours of field work. The matching funds are really, really important, but you need the commitment of someone or some group of people who are willing to get out here and do this work. Critical to this, and I think NRCS was pivotal in identifying some of the invasive species, particularly buckthorn, that it's simply gotten by me. And so here we have, right, we have buckthorn that, and this was prior to a logging operation. So as controversial as herbicide spraying can be, NRCS cost shared vegetative control services coming in to do treatment. We did a lot of physical removal, and ultimately all the edges were treated of the areas where patch cuts were going to take place. Some of the other things, practices, this was just a thicket of wild apple trees that had been a cow pasture up until about 1960. We've done a lot of apple tree release work, which has just proven to be a rich, rich resource for partridge and turkeys and coyotes and deer that are in this area near the barn all through the winter into late spring when it's so hard to find anything to eat. Of course, later, the next slide actually I think shows that area this summer, 6 years later, and it looks very tidy, but what you probably don't notice here is it's just a suite of invasives, because by opening it up to the sunlight, of course, they have thrived. So this is buckthorn, barberry, and bittersweet, which I swear is going to own the earth, because despite all our efforts, which are considerable, the bittersweet is ahead of us at the moment, and probably we are going to have to go back to some form of regular spraying. And then finally, I don't want to minimize the amount of time we do with invasive control, but I would say that the patch cuts have made both a huge difference in terms of, again, you had a mature 220 to 30 acre forest, but no early, very little early successional habitat, which Ellen Snyder felt was pivotal to supporting migratory birds. and other species. But that was really hard. I mean, logging is messy. And to see the forest that I'd known, for 35 years cut over a period of 6 weeks was not easy, but it was important. And at the end of it, also, the whole tree operator sheared the edges of the field, which was fantastic. In another 10 years, it's going to have to happen again. But the result of this patch cut is really, really evident now. This was in 2014. So now 6 years later, I think we could just look at the next slide, right? Logging's messy. And particularly at this time of year, you begin to get the fall rains and it just became a quagmire. But if you're working with a responsible forester, in the end, it was put right. And the next slide will show you what it looked like this spring, which is a thriving early successional habitat that is just rich with migratory birds, birds who are here through the year. There's huge diversity, and we also planted some native plant species out here, and there's a section of stream that through Tin Mountain, we did a trout stream restoration project. So I think we've hit a lot of the management practices. They do take persistence. I have to really thank the staff for supporting us in this work. And I think that is pretty much my story.
Thank you, Anne. If anyone has any questions, you could either unmute yourself or you could put it in the chat box.
Well, I think this is Donna. I think it's exciting to kind of have the overview on how easements work, and then have you share your example from the Dundee Forest. I think that's excellent. I was going to introduce. Thank you both very much for sharing this. This presentation is going to be recorded and posted so others can use it in the future. I was going to introduce a couple more folks while we had a minute. As I mentioned, every county has a conservation district, a county conservation district, and we're here to help landowners and towns work with issues like conservation planning and connecting folks with land trusts and others like Anne that have expertise and have gone through this process. Also wanted, so for Belknap County, including Jess, we also have Lisa Moran, who is our program coordinator for the county, and just does an excellent job on providing assistance and advice. So she's available. We'll be sharing her contact information. And I also wanted to introduce Jessie Wright. She's actually an employee of the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Districts, our statewide organization. And Jessie might just say a few comments with you. She's one of 2 conservation planners that we've hired statewide to help landowners and towns take advantage of, learn more about conservation planning and take advantage of some of the programs and assistance and resources that are available. So Jessie, did you want to share a little bit?
Sure, thanks,
Donna. Help us wrap up?
Yeah, I think it was, as you talked about, it was really nice to have both Don and Anne here. One of the questions I get most as a conservation planner is, what is conservation planning? And is that like an easement? People kind of get confused because there's so much in the realm and world of conservation that we can do to protect our natural resources. Conservation easements are very near and dear to my heart, and one of the best ways that I think we can, as landowners, protect our natural resources. But it's just one of the many tools that we have in our toolbox. As Anne went through her presentation, she ticked off a great number of projects that they have done up in Dundee, and all the projects that she talked about, starting with a wildlife management plan all the way through early successional habitat creation and late mowing, those are all practices that kind of make up your conservation plan. So when we talk about conservation planning, that's what we talk about, a long-term vision that can include so many different practices to protect your natural resources. So I work with one other person through NHACD in the state, but NRCS has an office in every county, much like our conservation districts, and all of the staff at NRCS and all of the staff at NHACD and all of the staff at each individual district, like Lisa, can help folks who own land get connected to a number of different things that you can do to enhance your natural resources. One of those is a conservation easement through a land trust or a conservation commission town, as Don talked about. So please feel free to get in touch with any of us here on the call about specific questions or different opportunities through land trusts, through NRCS, through NHACD. We're happy to work with any number of different landowners on different projects. So,
Donna, could I just butt in? I see a question from somebody on here, a question about, I have land with forest and wetlands, about 26 acres. Do land trusts ever say no to accepting an easement? And unfortunately, the answer to that is yes. We sometimes have to say no, only because our staff and financial resources are always limited, and we always have more, or we almost always have more inquiries and interest from landowners than we have the capacity to keep up with. And so we sometimes have to make hard decisions and say, gee, we're already overcommitted to projects this year or next year or whatever, and we just and the other projects may come in higher on our priority list for various reasons, because of large acreage or some unique natural qualities of the land, and therefore we just have to say no to sometimes to landowners. We're always receptive to talking with a landowner. We wouldn't say no without at least learning more about the land, but unfortunately we can't work with everybody who might like to conserve their land. Sometimes conservation commissions are an alternative to a land trust, and may be able to do a project that a land trust isn't able to do. But
well, and that said, Don, thank you very much. Sometimes a parcel of land, correct me if I'm wrong, might not have necessarily a unique feature, but it bridges two parcels of land that they really want to have.
absolutely.
And that might become an important parcel just because of that, and you don't realize.
Absolutely, Lisa, thank you. That's a great point. And that's why it's important to at least ask whether we or whatever other land trusts might be interested, because we may think of some reasons why your land is more valuable than the simple acreage figure may suggest. A variation on what Lisa is saying that I am that I'm experiencing right now is, we have a group of landowners in a town who one of them had a relatively smallish piece of land, but over the years has been talking with neighbors. And so we have a group of 4 neighbors who are working together, and we're working with them. And some of their parcels individually, if in isolation, might not have been something we would have felt we could do, but the 4 of them together, contiguous landowners and parcels, makes it a very exciting project.
I might add too that the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, which we've been mentioning, also has, for folks that have 10 acres or more, I think in many cases, that might be, a large enough spot, place where we can where there are opportunities to get cost share assistance, to do forest plans, to do wildlife management planning, to do work to improve, to protect streams and improve habitat. So, you know, there, in addition to easements, there's other opportunities out there by, you know, using a conservation plan, talking to somebody like Jesse. You can identify what your goals are, and see if there's some resources or some advice that you can get that can help you reach some of those objectives.
And the last thing that I'll chime in is, you know, Dawn talked a lot about the process of conservation easement, and it can be very complicated. You know, Anne talked about the dynamics of her family kind of up there. But we have some really great resources in this area through Lakes Region Conservation Trust, through the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust, through Green Mountain Conservancy, who are experts and so willing to help walk landowners through the process. So it may seem overwhelming, but there's a lot of are ready to help make the process a lot easier. So if there's any interest at all, I would say have the conversation.
All right, thank you to our presenters, Dawn and Anne. We hope that everyone can join us next week for our last session. And everyone have a good night. Thanks for attending.
But Jess, there's one more question that just came on. Can LRCT be the recipient in a will, or do they hate that?
No, we can't. Oh, I didn't see that. No, we can be. We would, if the landowner wants us to keep the land as conservation land, though, we need to know, we would like to know about it in advance, because it would be very unfortunate if someone had a small piece of land that didn't have significant conservation value, but surprised us with a gift of it, saying it had to be conserved. But that is a mechanism that can be used, and a variation on that we've done several times is what's called a donation of land with retention of a life estate, which means that the landowner can convey the ownership of the land during their lifetime and retain the right to live there if it's property with a house on it, and for the rest of their life. And then the land surrounding the house comes to us, or the full control of it comes to us only after the person has died. I don't know whether the questioner has a parcel that is land with a house or just raw land, but the short answer, and I've just given you the long answer, the short answer is yes, but it'd be great to talk about it, to understand the details and make sure that we're in a position to fulfill the landowner's objectives and vision for the property.
Jess, can you provide the resource of the contact information for Lisa and Dawn and Jesse, and I don't know, Anne, if you're willing to just so that if folks want to follow up and ask questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes, I can do that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. Have a good night.
All right, good night.
Night.
Thank you. Really appreciated your comments, Anne.